take a look at the context of administrative leadership. American chief executives stand apart from the executive branch agencies they're expected to lead. These officials are responsible for the operations of the bureaucracies that make up their respective executive branches. Chief executives are expected to set general policy directions and to provide the leadership necessary to manage government agency and programs. In the formulation of broad policy directions, executive leadership has been evident, especially in the past 5 decades. The ability of individual chief executives to influence their bureaucracies significantly cannot be taken for granted. Chief executive control is frequently challenged by external forces like the legislative branch, the judiciary, the media, and others who seek a voice in agency decisions. Presidents and most governors and many mayors have diverse and frequently disunited coalitions of political support that do not enable them to operate with a free hand or to speak with a consistent voice on all issues. Bureaucracies, on the other hand, have a limited range of policy interests because they're more specialized with narrower bases of support. Resources, in turn, gain the support of those in the legislatures and the public who seek favorable agency treatment of their interests. Political persuasion or jawboning is the power of chief executives to convince legislatures, administrators, and the general public that their policies should be adopted. To persuade public bureaucracies to follow their lead, chief executives must convince agency personnel that there will be reciprocal political and fiscal support for their specialized program interests. When agency programs clearly occupy a low priority on a chief executive's policy agenda, the agency may adopt procedurally to the executive's priorities. This is indicative of the agency's fear of retribution from an unfriendly or hostile chief executive. Control from one or the other side is rarely complete, but the conflict over control and power is ongoing. Interactions between chief executives and their administrative bureaucracies impact the executive's political and policy decisions. Policy development and policy implementation are distinct phases of chief executive involvement within their bureaucracies. Policy development, in broad outline, is what chief executives intend to do in their capacity as leaders of the bureaucracy. Policy development is the political and governmental process of formulating goals and directions for government activity and an overall framework of related programs. Even executives with extensive formal and political power, such as second term presidents, must depend on professionals in the bureaucracy for program advice and evaluation. Policy areas such as environmental protection, national defense, or transportation require more specialized technical expertise than most chief executives possess. Policy implementation makes chief executives even more dependent on their bureaucracies. Policy implementation is the political and governmental process of carrying out programs to fulfill specified policy objectives. Most chief executives, including presidents, governors, and mayors, are content to deal with dual difficulty. They must rely on bureaucratic expertise for much of the content of policy and, at the same time, seek agency compliance in implementing and evaluating policy as they desire. Strengthening and complicating the overall task of bureaucratic leadership, chief executives generally exercise leadership in three distinguishable but overlapping arenas. In the public arena, the chief executive commonly seeks to set the agenda for public discussion of policy issues and concerns. The legislative arena, in which a chief executive plays a major role in proposing specific legislation and influencing the course of legislative deliberations, and finally, the administrative or bureaucratic arena, in which chief executives must attempt to move administrators to effectively manage programs and policies as the chief executive wants them implemented. When leaving office, elected executives often expressed frustration with their inability to assert their leadership over administrative agencies. Because of the political dynamics linking in these three areas, the actions of executives in one arena may have impact in at least one other. The ability of chief executives to lead their bureaucracies effectively depends on a number of instruments or tools of leadership. Instruments or tools of leadership are various mechanisms such as legislative support, policy initiatives, and emergency decision making powers available to chief executives to help direct bureaucratic behavior. Three factors can help to shape the leadership environment. The chief executive's support in the legislature can affect leadership over bureaucracy. Second is the degree of or the potential for policy and program initiative exercised by the executive leader. Another source of strength is the capability of the chief executive to respond to crisis situations. The degree of legislative support for chief executives may vary during their term. Of great significance to virtually any chief executive is the central role in formulation of the executive budget, the proposals submitted to the legislature for dollar amounts to be allocated to executive branch agencies. Local chief executives often play a similar role. We'll focus on the president's budgetary role for the purposes of illustration in this course. The president's programmatic and budgetary priorities form the guidelines by which the OMB evaluates each agency's request for funds. Congress is not bound by presidential recommendations for agency budgetary allocations, but it typically appropriates an amount similar to, although usually lower than, that requested by the president and the OMB. When administrators propose legislation for consideration by Congress, central clearance with the OMB is a required formality. This gives the president an opportunity to review proposals for their consistency with its legislative program and platform. Agencies and their administrators may deal informally with Congress, but as a matter of routine, most agencies seek clearance and do not openly defy the president and OMB if clearance is denied. With passage of the Paperwork Reduction Act in the late 1980s, a new Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs with the OMB was established. Other proposals, some of which were adopted in whole or in part, included requiring cost-benefit analysis of proposed regulation. The budgetary influence of governors and local chief executives is particularly varied, but in general, few state or local executives can match the president's sustained impact on budget-making processes. Many governors find their positions defined and often restrained by formal legal and political factors. In recent decades, there's been considerable change in state constitutions, most of it favorable to the exercise of stronger gubernatorial leadership, including leadership of state bureaucracies. As amending the Constitution was made easier, efforts increased to update provisions bearing on the exercise of governors' powers, including some that are budget related. One leadership instrument available to the president and to governors as a source of budgetary influence is veto power. The president may veto any legislation after Congress has passed it, but the president's veto power is limited by the requirement that the president must approve or disapprove the entire bill. For this reason, among others, presidents vetoed relatively infrequently, making the veto power less significant than it might have been. Most governors have a similar veto power. More importantly, however, 43 governors also have an unrestricted line item veto, enabling them to disapprove specific provisions of a bill while signing the rest of it into law. Item veto power enables most governors to exert control with something resembling surgical precision. In many American cities and towns, the office of the mayor is a more ceremonial one than that of a working chief administrator, so there's a little influence in the budget making process. Still, the budget role of local executives is somewhat more modest than that of either governors or presidents. A second important set of tools that chief executives may use to influence their respective bureaucracies is personnel management. There's considerable varieties in the types of personnel systems, for example, patronage or merit systems. All of these systems deal with how we manage people in public organizations. Patronage emphasizes political party or policy loyalty as a basis for making personnel decisions, hiring, on the job evaluation, promotions, and transfers. The concept of merit, on the other hand, is the basis for a system under which the employee is hired and later evaluated on the basis of career focused, job related competence. The merit employee is presumed to place much more emphasis on career development and much less emphasis on loyalty to the individual leader. Limitations on presidential influence over political appointees and on the influence of presidents and appointees alike over the bureaucracy are complex and deserve examination. Political appointees, in turn, have had their own difficulties in directing the activities of their respective bureaucracy. It's so more than simply a case of bureaucrats being in government longer than most political appointees, though that's part of it. Reductions in force are systematic reductions or downsizing in the number of personnel positions allocated to a government agency or agencies. At the state and local levels, there are still some concerns similar to those at the national level and substantial differences as well. In many states, there are boards and commissions created by the legislature to which the governor cannot name members. The local level presents a mixed picture, especially as local governments have become increasingly professionalized. More common is the local government in which a merit system represents the formal mechanism for personnel management. On the whole, however, the local chief executive is less influential in this respect today than in the past. Reorganization is authority delegated by the legislature to the chief executive to add or subtract staff positions. It also includes the ability to restructure organizational arrangements to achieve policy goals as well as increased economy, efficiency, and effectiveness of bureaucratic agencies. Reorganization authority is a legacy of the reform movements of the early 1900s. Traditionally, reorganization was aimed at increasing economy and efficiency, clarifying chains of command, and the like. And with few exceptions, presidents and governors who possess generous reorganization authority have approached their efforts with those objectives in mind. Proponents of reorganization often seem to regard it as a cure-all for correcting bureaucratic ills, touted as the means of eliminating waste and saving billions of dollars. Yet this has likely been oversold. Reorganizations, although useful, have higher political costs and fewer benefits for a chief executive than many imagine. Reorganizations fail to deliver on their promises because their strategies for rationalizing and simplifying the executive branch often clash with one another. Control over information represents a broad approach to maintaining chief executive influence over bureaucratic agencies as well as in the policy-making process. The more complex the bureaucratic structure of any given executive branch, the greater the challenge to the chief executive in terms of information gathering and use. The president must deal increasingly with a highly specialized and expert bureaucracy without being dominated by or becoming excessively dependent on their sources of information. Task force are temporary cross-functional teams responsible for achieving a particular goal, often drawn from several departments within a larger agency. The strength of a governor's staff and executive office resources, including information capabilities, must also be addressed. In recent decades, many states have made considerable progress in these areas, with a consequent increase in gubernatorial effectiveness. Obtaining reliable information that gives a clear, complete picture of what's going on in the bureaucracy is on the other side of the coin. Unless there's some disruption in the normal routine of administration, the chief executive does not have to be informed about the details of administrative activity. In traditional administrative thinking, this assumption is called the exception principle, suggesting that only exceptions to routine operations merit involvement of the chief executive. There's a natural reluctance to communicate bad news through the hierarchy, and a staff may prefer not to call attention to activities that are likely to be unpopular with a supervisor. Leaders cope with problems in acquiring information by making use of external sources of information or using informal channels to supplement formal ones. Executive privilege is the claim, largely unsupported by the federal courts, made by presidents that confidential information exchanged between themselves and their advisors cannot be released without the president's approval. In terms of public and congressional leadership by the president, control of information can become a critical instrument. Individual administrators in key positions within bureaucracies could have more to do with shaping the available alternatives for presidential decisions through provision of information on program failures and successes than any other institution or person. The institutional, legal, and personal factors that facilitate strong executive leadership seem to operate at all levels of government. The chief executive's political strength in the legislature and as a leader of a political party or fraction adds substantially to leadership capability in office. The power to initiate policy proposals and see that they are carried out politically is a key element of executive leadership. The capacity to respond to crisis situations requiring immediate, coordinated direction has strengthened chief executives' positions. A central role in executive budget making strengthens the overall influence of the chief executive. A critical resource is control over executive branch personnel decisions. The ability to propose agency reorganizations enhances the chief executive's power, particularly if the legislature must accept or reject the proposals as a package. Chief executive information resources constitute a source of potential strength. Information can be a key source of executive influence. Leadership has attracted great interest in both ancient and modern times from scholars, generals, politicians, and more casual observers. Virtually every culture, from the most primitive to the most complex, has operated within some sort of framework in which leadership functions are differentiated, identified, and exercised by some and not others. Prescriptions for leadership have been written and revised, and exercise of leadership has been carefully analyzed and often sharply criticized. Administrative leadership is exercised within specific organizational settings as well as in the context of the larger environment. Both can significantly influence the behavior of leaders. In administrative hierarchies, leadership is a multidimensional function because of multiple levels of organization, wide variation in specific tasks, and numerous situations requiring leadership of some kind. If leadership is to be effective, a deliberate effort must be made to overcome inevitable barriers inside organizations. Bear in mind that the individual who may play a follower relative to a higher level official may be a leader to others occupying subordinate positions. Thus, leadership development is equally important for followers who may share or co-produce some goods or services within an organization. The earliest efforts to analyze leadership employed two principal approaches, centering on the individual leader and on the leadership situation. The traits approach is a traditional method, now used less widely, of analyzing leadership in a group or an organization. It assumes that certain personality characteristics, such as intelligence, ambition, tact, and diplomacy, distinguish leaders from others in a group. Situational leadership is a method of analyzing leadership in a group or organization that emphasizes factors in the particular leadership situation, such as leader-follower interaction, group values, and the work being done. Another general dimension of leadership is how specific styles of management affect the distribution of power, influence, and freedom of action of leaders and followers in an organization. Group situations vary according to position power of the leader, defined as the authority vested in the leader's official position, task structure of the group, the degree to which assignments can be programmed and is specified in a step-by-step fashion, and leader-member personal relationships based on affection, admiration, and trust of group members for the leader. Leaders who are liked and respected by a group have a high position power and are more favorable in terms of the leader's position for those who have poor relationship with group members and weak positional power. Recent research suggests that leadership comes from the interaction among people in a work situation and requires a combination of interpersonal and group situational skills. Leadership in a non hierarchical organization is defined as the property of a social system in which individuals, groups, leaders, and followers interact. Relational leadership leaders must not only be competent at traditional skills such as goal setting, conflict management, and motivation, but also be able to adapt their leadership styles to fit the needs of followers. In the early 1980s, research findings appeared to give renewed emphasis to the importance of personality characteristics in leaders. Far greater sophistication and understanding that we now possess of individual and group psychology have contributed to this reality. There has been a systematic effort to identify different dimensions of leadership personality in much greater detail. As anyone with managerial responsibility already knows, attempts to change or direct group behavior can be frustrating. It's difficult enough to change individual behavior. It can be extremely difficult to change the behavior of an organization subgroup made up of diverse individuals. For a leader to overcome member resistance requires the ability to convey a sense of the larger issue, mission, and the needs that justify the existence of the organization. The key to a leader's efforts as director is to reconcile personal and organizational goals and to create as much psychological overlap as possible between the two. Motivation continues to be a complex task of leadership. People respond to leadership that is clearly defined and, at the same time, pervasive, fair, and supportive. Leader as motivator centers on devices such as tangible benefits, positive social interaction, work interest, and leadership that is self-confident, pervasive, fair, and supportive. Another dimension of leadership is coordination and integration of organizational activities in order to mesh the leader's own tasks with those of the remainder of the organization. Leader as coordinator involves bringing some order to the multitude of functions within a complex organization. Most important is to recognize the tendency for individuals concentrating on their own particular work environment to develop tunnel vision. Tunnel vision results from a fear of mistakes, missed deadlines, and focus on a narrow work environment, which limits the ability to see an organization's activity as a whole. Mechanisms for generating ideas for work redesign include focus groups, surveys, question and answer sessions, and advanced communication of proposed actions to members, all of which help to address this issue. When members understand and support organizational objectives, and the leader has made clear how individual activities help promote those objectives, then they may be a successful catalyst. Leader as catalyst or innovator involves formalized conception of the spark plug role in a group setting. As part of the catalyst role, a leader is expected to introduce innovations into an organization. The process of innovation is tied to the role of a leader as catalyst because the organization's routine operations often do not require very substantial direct participation. Leader as crisis manager involves coping with both immediate and long-term difficulties more serious than routine managerial challenge. Downsizing current fiscal pressures on public organizations have spawned the need for downsizing in many places, forcing leaders to use a variety of new tactics. Organizations comprising diverse specialties and functions require efforts at the top as well as throughout the ranks to bring about satisfactory coordination and integration of goals. Organization members need some sense that their different functions somehow fit into a larger shared vision of the mission of the organization, and leaders must take responsibility for instilling that view. Without claiming to have found the answers, let's suggest a number of general considerations relevant to achieving effective leadership. First, it's important that a leader convey to members that they're regarded as valuable to the organization and competent in their work. Second, if staff members perceive leadership as being receptive to ideas, feedback, comments, and even complaints from below, they will be far more willing to respond to leaders' directives. Third, several studies suggest that the democratic leader is more effective in the broad view than any other type, with member satisfaction clearly higher in democratically led groups. This points to the reality that collaboration is an essential function of leadership. Fourth, a study of work groups in private industry indicated that more highly employees rated supervisors on a number of key attributes, the less employees expressed a desire for unionization. At the risk of oversimplification, it's worth pointing out that several other important qualities of leadership exist. Let's take a look. Ideally, a leader should be clear, reasonable, and consistent concerning expectations of and standards of judgment for member performance. A leader should deal openly, fairly, and equitably with all members, making distinctions among members only on work related, not personal or lifestyle criteria. At the same time, leaders foster a constructive two-way flow of communication by explaining rationales for proposed courses of action and by acting on worthwhile suggestions from members. A leader should move carefully and democratically to secure consensus on significant action. A wise leader will try to prevent empire building and other divisive tendencies within the ranks. The goal is to prevent disunity as a step towards building cohesion within the group. A leader should absolutely avoid cynicism, particularly to friends and associates, and favoritism. Perhaps hardest of all, a leader can greatly influence the whole course of events in an organization by setting the tone of interactions with the members. Leadership in contemporary organizations clearly operates under greater restraints from several standpoints: declining resources, pressures for greater diversity in the workplace, public distrust, to name a few. Yet many still aspire to positions of leadership, and there's no question that effective leadership is essential in our attempts to cope with rapid change. Despite many things that are very different from the past, there is continuing and justifiable interest in leadership roles.